Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about two topics that often make this body and sometimes my side of the aisle uncomfortable. I want to talk about the fight that is on across the world, but particularly in the Middle East, for the soul of Islam and how it matters to the United States. And I want to talk about our relationship with Saudi Arabia and the connection to the former issue. We frequently hear this criticism of President Obama that he doesn't have a strategy to defeat ISIS. And I fundamentally don't believe that that's true. He does have a strategy, and it's largely working when you look at the metrics on the ground. You see that ISIS's territory in Iraq and Syria have been reduced by about 30% over the course of the last year. We've tightened our immigration policies here to make sure that the bad guys don't get in. We've stood up a more capable fighting force inside Iraq. We've clamped down significantly on ISIS's sources of revenue and financing. I mean, listen, it's hard to win, right, when only one spectacular and deadly strike can erase all of your good work, but the president does have a strategy on the ground right now inside Iraq and inside Syria. The problem is that it is still a relatively short-term strategy. And as we debate how to defeat ISIS or groups like it, our strategic prescriptions are all relatively short-term. We use military force, we try to retake territory, we try to take out top terrorist leaders, we clamp down on sources of financing. These are necessary and important measures to combat a serious threat to the United States, but they really don't address the underlying conditions that lead to radicalization. And addressing those factors are really the only way to ensure that the next iteration of ISIS, whoever it is, whatever it is, wherever it is, doesn't just simply emerge in its place. And so my argument today, Mr. President, is that one of the reasons why no one really has a particularly credible long-term strategy is that it would involve engaging in some really uncomfortable truths about the nature of the fight ahead of us and about the imperfections of one of our most important allies in the Middle East. And so to make this case to you, I want to first bring you to northwest Pakistan and ask my colleagues to imagine that you are a parent of, let's say, a 10-year-old boy. You're illiterate, you're poor, you're getting poorer by the day. Unemployment in your village is sky high. Inflation is robbing you of any wealth that you may have. Your crop yields have been miserable. But one day you get a visit that changes your perspective. A cleric from a nearby conservative mosque offers you a different path. He tells you that your poverty is not your fault, but simply a punishment handed down to you because of your unintentional deviation from the true path of Islam. Luckily, there's a way to get right to God, to submit your only son to Islam. And it gets even better. This cleric is going to offer to educate your son at his own school. And we call them madrasas. And not only will you not have to pay for the education, this school is going to actually pay you maybe $6,000 just to send your son there. And when your son finishes school, this individual promises you that he will find him employment in the service of Islam. Your 10-year-old, previously destined to lead a life that was perhaps more hopeless than your own, is now going to get free housing and meals, religious instruction, the promise of a job when he's older, and you get money that you badly need and improved favor with God. For thousands of families in destitute places like northwest Pakistan, you can see how it's often a pretty easy choice. But as the years go on, you lose touch with your son. The school cuts off your access to him. And when you do get to see him every now and again, you see him changing. And then one day, it's over. He's not the little boy that you once knew. He's a teenager, and he's announcing to you that the only way to show true faith with Islam is to fight for it against the infidels who are trying to pollute the Muslim faith, or against the Westerners who are trying to destroy it. He tells you that he is going off to Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq or with some fellow students, and you shouldn't worry about him because God is on his side. You start asking questions to find out what happened in this school, and you start to learn. You discover the textbooks that he read that taught him a brand of Islam greatly influenced by something called Wahhabism, a strain of Islam based on the earliest form of the religion practiced under the first four caliphs. It holds that any deviation from Islamic originalism is heresy. In school, your son was therefore taught an ideology of hate towards the unbeliever, defined as Christians, Jews, Hindus, but also Shiites and Sufis and Sunni Muslims who don't follow the Wahhabi doctrine. He's told that the Crusades never ended, that aid organizations, schools, government offices, they're just modern weapons of the West's continuing crusade against his faith, and that it is a religious obligation to do battle against the infidels. I tell my colleagues this story because some version of it plays out hundreds of times every day in far-flung places, from Pakistan to Kosovo, Nigeria to Indonesia. The teaching of intolerant Islam to hundreds of millions of young people. Think about this. In 1956, there were 244 of these madrasas in Pakistan. Today, there are 24,000. Now, these schools are multiplying all over the globe, and yet I don't want you to get me wrong. These schools, by and large, aren't directly teaching violence. They aren't the minor leagues for Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but they do teach a version of Islam that leads very nicely into an anti-Shia, anti-Western militancy. And I also don't mean to suggest that Wahhabism is the only sect of Islam that can be perverted into violence. Iran's Shia clerics are also using religion in order to export violence as well. But it's important to note that the vicious terrorist groups that Americans know by name are Sunni in derivation and greatly influenced by Wahhabi Salafist teachings. And of course, the real rub is, Mr. President, that we've known this. We've known this for a really long time. Secretaries of State, ambassadors, diplomats, four-star generals, they've all complained over and over again about it. And yet we do very little to stop this long, slow spread of intolerance. We don't address it because to do so would force us to confront two very difficult issues. The first is how we talk sensibly about Islam. Right now, we're caught between two extremes. Leading Republicans, they want to begin and end this discussion with a debate over what we call terrorists. And of course, the leading candidate for president often equates the entire religion with violence. Now, this debate over nomenclature, I think, is overwrought, but I certainly understand the problem of labeling something radical Islamic terrorism because it gives purchase to this unforgivable argument that all Muslims are radicals or terrorists. And so many Republicans don't want to go any deeper into the conversation than just simply labeling the threat. But Democrats, frankly, aren't that much better. The leaders of my party often do backflips to avoid using these kind of terms. But of course, that forestalls any conversation about the fight within Islam for the soul of the religion. It's a disservice to this debate to simply brand every Muslim a threat to the West, but it's also a disservice to refuse to acknowledge that though ISIS has perverted Islam to a degree to make it unrecognizable, the seeds of this perversion are rooted in a much more mainstream version of that faith that derives in substantial part from the teachings of Wahhabism. And so leaders of both parties need to avoid the extremes of this debate and enter into a real conversation about how America can help the moderate voices within Islam win out over those that would sow the seeds of extremism. Let me give you an example. Last fall, I visited the Hidayah Center in Abu Dhabi. It's a U.S.-supported, Arab-led initiative to counter-program against extremist messaging. And when I pressed the center's leadership on the need to confront Wahhabi teaching and the mainstream roots of extremism, they blanched. They said that was out of their lane. They were focused on the branches of extremism, not the trunk. But of course, by then, it's probably too late. Now, America, frankly, doesn't have the moral authority or the weight to tip the scales in this fight between moderate Islam and less tolerant Islam. Muslim communities and Muslim nations need to be leading this fight. But America, and most notably, sometimes the leaders of my party, also can't afford to shut our eyes to the struggle that's playing out in real time. And that brings me to the second uncomfortable truth. And I present it to you in a quote from Farah Pandith, who was President Obama's former special representative to Muslim communities. In a moment of candor, she commented that in her travel to 80 different countries in her official position, she said, quote, "In every place that I visited, The Wahhabi influence was an insidious presence, funded by Saudi money. The second uncomfortable truth is that for all of the positive aspects of our alliance with Saudi Arabia, there's another side to that country than the one that faces us in our bilateral relationship. And it is a side that we can no longer afford to ignore as our fight against Islamic extremism becomes more focused and more complicated. But first, let me acknowledge that there are a lot of good aspects of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I don't agree with cynics who say that our relationship is just an alliance to facilitate the exchange of oil for cash and cash for weapons. Our common bond was formed in the Cold War when American and Saudi leaders found common ground in the fight against communism. The unofficial détente today between Sunni nations and Israel, well, that's a product in part of Saudi-led diplomacy. There have been many high-profile examples of cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia in the fight against al-Qaeda and ISIS. And more generally, our partnership with Saudi Arabia, the most powerful, richest country in the Arab world, it serves as a really important bridge to the Islamic community. It's a direct rebuttal of this terrorist ideology that asserts that we seek a war with Islam. But increasingly, we just can't afford to ignore the more problematic aspects of Saudi policies. The political alliance between the House of Saud and the conservative Wahhabi clerics is as old as the nation. And this alliance has resulted in billions of dollars funneled to and through the Wahhabi movement. Those 24,000 religious schools in Pakistan, thousands of them are funded with money that originates in Saudi Arabia. So are mosques in Brussels, Jakarta, and Paris. According to some estimates, since the 1960s, the Saudis have funneled over $100 billion in funding to these schools all over the world with a mission of spreading puritanical Wahhabism. As a point of comparison, researchers suggest that the Soviet Union spent about $7 billion, a fraction of that, during the entire period of 1920 to 1991. Less well-funded governments and other strains of Islam they can't keep up with this tsunami of money behind the export of intolerance. Now, rightfully, Mr. President, we engage in daily castigations of Iran for sponsoring terrorism throughout the region. But why does Saudi Arabia largely get off the hook from direct public criticism from political leaders simply because they're a few degrees separated from the terrorists who are inspired by the ideology that their money helps spread? Why do we say virtually nothing about the human rights abuses inside Saudi Arabia, fueled by this conservative religious movement, when we so easily call out other countries for similar outrageous behavior? Second, Mr. President, we need to have a reckoning with the Saudis about the effect of their growing proxy war with Iran. Now, there's more than enough blame to be spread around when it comes to this widening Saudi-Iranian fault line in the Middle East. And I'd argue that the lion's share of the fault lies with the Iranians. They are the top exporter of terrorism and brutality. For decades, they have been. It's primarily Iranian-backed groups that have destabilized places like Lebanon and Iraq. It's the Iranians that are propping up a murderous regime in Damascus. But in the wake of the Iran nuclear agreement, there are many in Congress who would have the United States double down in our support for the Saudi side of this fight in places like Yemen and Syria, simply because Saudi Arabia is our named friend and Iran is our named enemy. But the Middle East, it just doesn't work like that anymore. And there's growing evidence that our support for a Saudi-led military campaign in places like Yemen are prolonging human misery and, frankly, aiding extremism. $90 billion in U.S. arms sales money has gone to Saudi Arabia during the Obama administration to help them carry out a campaign in Yemen against the Iranian-backed Houthis. Our government says that its top priority in Yemen is defeating AQAP, which is arguably al-Qaeda's deadliest franchise. But this ongoing chaos has created a security vacuum in Yemen in which AQAP can thrive and even expand. No expert would dispute that since the Saudi campaign began in Yemen, al-Qaeda has expanded in Yemen, and ISIL has gained new territory and a new recruitment foothold. And to make matters worse, Saudi Arabia and some of our other GCC allies are so focused on this fight against Iran that they have dramatically scaled back or in some cases totally ended their military efforts against ISIS. How under these circumstances does military support for Saudi Arabia help us in our fight against extremism, if that's our number one goal? So here are my recommendations. The U.S. should get serious about this. We should suspend supporting Saudi Arabia's military campaign in Yemen, at the very least until We get assurances that this campaign does not distract against the fight against ISIS or al-Qaeda. And until we make some progress on this export of Wahhabism throughout the region and throughout the world. And Congress shouldn't sign off on any more military sales to Saudi Arabia unless similar assurances are granted. If we are serious about constructing a winning long-term strategy against ISIS and al-Qaeda, then our horizons have to extend beyond the day-to-day, the here and now, the fight in just Syria and Iraq. We need to admit that there is a fight on for the future of Islam. And while we can't have the dispositive influence on that fight, we also just can't sit on the sidelines. Both parties here need to acknowledge this reality, and the U.S. needs to lead by example by ending our effective acquiescence to the Saudi export of intolerant Islam. And we need to be careful about not blindly backing our friends' plays in conflicts that simply create more instability, more political and security vacuums into which ISIS and other extremist groups can fill, like what's going on in Yemen today. Now, we need to work with the Saudis and other partners to defeat ISIS militarily, but at the same time, we need to work together to address the root causes of extremism. Saudi Arabia's counter-radicalization programs and new anti-terrorism initiatives, they're good steps that show that Saudi leaders recognize some of these problems. But they need to do more. Tackling intolerant ideologies, refusing to incentivize destabilizing proxy wars, these are the elements of a long-term anti-extremism strategy, and we should pursue this strategy, Mr. President, even if it makes us, on occasion, uncomfortable.